What would you do if someone attacked the core of your beliefs in front of 500 strangers? When a militant atheist student tried to humiliate Charlie Kirk's Christianity, nobody expected his response to become the most powerful defense of faith ever recorded. November 15, 2019. UC Berkeley's Wheeler Hall. The clock on the wall read 7:15 p.m., and Charlie Kirk was adjusting his microphone. The 500-seat auditorium was packed beyond capacity for his talk titled Free Thought and American Values. But what Charlie didn't know was that sitting in the third row, someone had come with a mission to destroy everything he believed in. Her name was Sarah Williams, a 22-year-old philosophy graduate student with piercing green eyes and a reputation for intellectual brutality. Sarah was the president of UC Berkeley's Rational Thought Society, a campus organization dedicated to what they called liberating minds from religious superstition. For weeks she had been preparing for this moment, researching every possible angle to dismantle Charlie Kirk's Christian worldview. Sarah wasn't just another skeptical student. She was brilliant, articulate, and angry. Her philosophy professors knew her as the student who could tear apart any theological argument in minutes. Her fellow students respected her sharp intellect and feared her cutting questions. Tonight she had come armed with what she believed were the perfect weapons to expose Christianity as nothing more than Bronze Age mythology. As Charlie took the stage, Sarah opened her notebook filled with meticulously researched critiques. She had studied the Crusades, the Inquisition, slavery justifications, the oppression of women, and every dark chapter in Christian history. Her strategy was simple: present an overwhelming case that Christianity had been a force of evil in the world, then watch Charlie Kirk crumble under the weight of historical evidence. "Good evening, Berkeley," Charlie began, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had addressed thousands of audiences. "I'm honored to be here tonight to talk about the foundations of American liberty." The crowd was a typical Berkeley mix: conservative students who had come to support Charlie, liberal students who had come to challenge him, and curious minds who simply wanted to witness what promised to be an intellectual battle. "The foundation of American values," Charlie continued, "is individual freedom. And this freedom doesn't come from government, from institutions, or from human consensus. It comes from our God-given rights, endowed by our Creator." That's when Sarah struck. She didn't wait for the Q&A session. She didn't raise her hand politely. Instead, she stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through Charlie's words like a blade. "Wait just a minute," she called out, her voice projecting across the auditorium with the force of someone who had trained in debate competitions. "Are you seriously standing there in 2019 at one of America's premier universities telling us that imaginary friends in the sky are the basis for political philosophy?" The reaction was immediate. Some students gasped at the directness of the challenge. Others began to murmur, sensing that this wasn't going to be a typical evening. A few conservative students looked uncomfortable, wondering how Charlie would handle such an aggressive opening attack. But Sarah wasn't finished. She had spent too much time preparing for this moment to hold back now. "Before you answer," she continued, her voice gaining momentum, "let me save you some time. I've done my research. Christianity has been responsible for the Crusades, the Inquisition, the justification of slavery, the oppression of women, the persecution of scientists, and countless wars throughout history. And you want us to believe this is the foundation of freedom?" The auditorium fell into complete silence. This wasn't a question, it was a declaration of war. Sarah had essentially accused Charlie Kirk of promoting a violent, oppressive ideology disguised as spiritual truth. Charlie stood at the podium, his hand still gripping the microphone. For a moment that felt like an eternity, he said nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably as 500 people waited to see how the young conservative leader would respond to such a direct and comprehensive attack on his faith. Some audience members expected Charlie to get angry, others thought he might dismiss Sarah or call for security. A few wondered if he would try to defend Christianity with traditional apologetic arguments about how those historical events weren't real Christianity. But what happened next, nobody saw coming. Instead of the defensive response everyone expected, Charlie did something that would change not just the trajectory of this evening, but Sarah's entire worldview. He smiled, not a condescending smile, but one filled with what looked like genuine appreciation. "Sarah," he said, reading her name from the student ID badge clipped to her jacket, Thank you for that question. In fact, thank you for that challenge. The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the response they had anticipated from either side of this confrontation. Because Charlie continued, stepping away from the podium and closer to the edge of the stage, you've just asked the most important question any Christian will ever face. And with those words, the evening took a turn that no one in Wheeler Hall would ever forget. You've just asked the most important question any Christian will ever face, Charlie repeated, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent auditorium. And that question is, does my faith actually make the world better, or does it make it worse? Sarah remained standing, but her confident posture wavered slightly. She had prepared for argument, for defensiveness, for denial. She had not prepared for agreement, for defensiveness, for denial. She had not prepared for agreement. Sarah, you mentioned the Crusades, the Inquisition, slavery, the oppression of women, Charlie continued, stepping down from the stage entirely. And you know what? You're absolutely right about all of those things. They happened, they were wrong, and they were done by people who called themselves Christians. A murmur rippled through the audience. Conservative students looked concerned. Was Charlie conceding defeat before the battle had even begun? Liberal students were confused. Where was the pushback they expected? But here's what I want to ask you, Sarah, and everyone else in this room, Charlie said, now walking slowly down the center aisle toward where Sarah stood. When those things happened, the violence, the oppression, the hatred, were they happening because of Jesus' teachings or in spite of Jesus' teachings? Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but Charlie held up a gentle hand. Hold on, let me finish this thought, and then I promise I'll give you the floor, he said. Because this distinction isn't just academic, it's everything. The auditorium was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system seemed loud. Every eye was focused on this unexpected dialogue unfolding in real time. Sarah, I want you to imagine something, Charlie continued, now only a few rows away from her. Imagine you had never heard of Christianity, never been influenced by church history, never read any theological arguments. Imagine you just picked up the New Testament and read Jesus' actual words. What would you find? He paused, letting the question hang in the air. You would find a man who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." A man who said, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." A man who said, "Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me." A man who spent his time with the outcasts, the marginalized, the people society had written off. Sarah's notebook, filled with her carefully prepared attacks, remained closed in her hands. So Sarah, when people calling themselves Christians conquered lands in Jesus' name, were they following his teaching to turn the other cheek? When they enslaved people, were they following his command to love your neighbor as yourself? When they oppressed women, were they following his revolutionary practice of treating women as equals in a male-dominated society? Charlie had now reached Sarah's row. He stood in the aisle looking directly at her, but his voice remained calm and conversational. The answer is no. They weren't following Jesus, they were using Jesus. They were taking his name and using it to justify their own power, their own greed, their own prejudices. And that, Sarah, is not Christianity. That's the opposite of Christianity. For the first time since she had stood up, Sarah spoke. But how can you separate the religion from its history, she asked, her voice carrying less hostility than before. If this is what Christianity produces, isn't that evidence of what Christianity really is? That's a fair question, Charlie replied, but let me ask you this. Do you apply that same standard to other ideologies you support? Sarah looked puzzled. For example, Charlie continued, I assume you support feminism, but what if I pointed to instances where people calling themselves feminists have promoted hatred toward men or excluded women who don't fit their ideological purity tests? Would you say that feminism itself is evil, or would you say those people aren't representing true feminism? Sarah's eyes narrowed as she processed this analogy. Or what about science? Charlie pressed on. Science gave us medicine and technology, but it also gave us chemical weapons and nuclear bombs. Some scientists have promoted racism through pseudo-scientific theories. Does that make science itself evil, or does it mean some people have misused science? That's different, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Charlie asked gently, Or could it be that every powerful idea, whether religious, political, or scientific, can be used for good or corrupted for evil, depending on the hearts of the people who claim to follow it? But Charlie wasn't done. What he said next would completely shift the conversation from intellectual debate to something much more personal. "Sarah," he said, his voice softening, "can I ask you something? And I promise, this isn't a trap or a gotcha question. I'm genuinely curious." Sarah nodded cautiously. "Why does this matter so much to you? Why are you so passionate about challenging Christianity specifically?" It was a simple question, but it hit Sarah like a physical blow. Suddenly, the philosophical debate became intensely personal, and the carefully constructed wall between her intellect and her emotions began to crumble. Sarah stood there for a long moment, Charlie's question hanging in the air between them. The auditorium remained silent, but the quality of that silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of people waiting for an intellectual sparring match. It was the silence of people sensing they were about to witness something deeply human. Sarah began, then stopped. Her hands tightened around her notebook, and for the first time since she had stood up, she looked vulnerable. "Take your time," Charlie said gently. "There's no pressure to answer if you don't want to." But something in his tone, the genuine curiosity without judgment, seemed to unlock something in Sarah that she had kept carefully hidden. "I used to go to church," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the silent room. "When I was little. My mom, she thought it would be good for us." Charlie nodded encouragingly but said nothing. "We didn't have much money," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength but also beginning to tremble with emotion. "My dad had left when I was 6, and my mom was working 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. She thought the church would be a community for us, a place where people would care about us." The audience was riveted. This was no longer a political debate. This was a young woman sharing her deepest pain in front of 500 strangers. "But they didn't care about us," Sarah's voice cracked. "They cared about whether our clothes were nice enough, whether we could afford to contribute to the offering, whether my mom was a good Christian woman despite being divorced. They whispered about us. They made us feel like we weren't worthy to be there." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes, and several audience members found themselves wiping away their own tears as they listened. "I was 8 years old," Sarah continued, "and I remember sitting in Sunday school, listening to lessons about how Jesus loved everyone. But then I'd go to the sanctuary and watch those same adults who taught those lessons ignore my mom when she tried to make friends or make comments about how certain people were bringing down the neighborhood." Charlie's heart was breaking as he listened, but he remained quiet, understanding that Sarah needed to get this out. "So I started asking questions," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger with anger and hurt. "If these people really believed what they claimed to believe, why were they treating us this way? And the more I asked, the more I realized that Christianity wasn't about love at all. It was about power, about judgment, about creating insiders and outsiders." She looked directly at Charlie now, her eyes blazing with years of accumulated pain. "So yes, Mr. Kirk, I'm passionate about challenging Christianity because I've seen what it really does to people. I've seen how it promises love and delivers judgment. I've seen how it claims to care about the poor while making poor people feel unwelcome, and I've dedicated my life to protecting other people from that kind of spiritual abuse." The auditorium was completely silent. Many people were crying now, not just from Sarah's story, but from recognition. Her experience resonated with others who had their own painful encounters with religious communities. Charlie stood there for a moment, absorbing what Sarah had shared. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah," he said, "I am so sorry that happened to you, and I want to tell you something. Those people were wrong. What they did to you and your mother was not just unkind, it was the exact opposite of everything Jesus taught." Sarah looked surprised by the directness of his apology. "But I want to ask you something else," Charlie continued. "And please don't take this as me minimizing what you went through, because I'm not. What you experienced was real, and it was wrong, and it caused real damage." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But Sarah, what if I told you that those people who hurt you, they weren't following Christianity? What if they were actually betraying Christianity?" "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, genuine curiosity mixing with her skepticism. I mean, Charlie said, what if the problem wasn't Jesus's message but people who used Jesus's name while ignoring his message entirely? Charlie began walking closer to Sarah, but his movement was gentle, non-threatening. Think about it, he continued. Jesus spent his time with tax collectors, the most despised people in society. He ate with prostitutes. He welcomed children when his disciples tried to push them away. His closest friends were fishermen and outcasts. And when people tried to judge others, he said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Sarah was listening intently now, her notebook forgotten. So when those church people made you feel unwelcome because you didn't have money, they weren't acting like Jesus. They were acting like the Pharisees that Jesus constantly criticized. When they judged your mother for being divorced, they were doing exactly what Jesus said not to do. Charlie was now standing directly in front of Sarah's row. Sarah, what if everything you experienced wasn't Christianity failing, but Christianity being failed? The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Sarah thought she knew. For years she had built her worldview around the premise that Christianity was inherently hypocritical, that the gap between its promises and its practice proved it was false. But Charlie was suggesting something entirely different. Sarah started, then stopped. For someone who prided herself on always having an answer, she found herself genuinely uncertain for the first time in years. "Let me try a different approach," Charlie said gently. "Sarah, you're clearly passionate about justice. You care about the poor, the marginalized, the people who get pushed aside by society. That's why what happened to you and your mother made you so angry, because you have a strong sense of right and wrong." Sarah nodded slowly. "So let me ask you this. Where do you think that sense of justice comes from? Why do you care so deeply about defending people who can't defend themselves?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Sarah said, but her voice was uncertain. "But according to your worldview," Charlie continued, "we're all just random collections of atoms that happen to form consciousness through evolutionary accident. If that's true, why should we care about anyone else? Why shouldn't it just be survival of the fittest?" Sarah opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. This wasn't the direction she had expected the conversation to go. "I think you care about justice," Charlie said, "because you were made to care about justice. I think you have such a strong reaction to hypocrisy because you were designed to recognize truth and to be disturbed when people violate it." "Made by whom?" Sarah asked, but her tone was more curious than hostile now. "By the same God who put that same sense of justice in Jesus," Charlie replied. "The God who looked at a world full of oppression and inequality and said, 'This isn't how it's supposed to be.'" Charlie paused, letting that sink in. "Sarah, what if I told you that you and Jesus want the same things? What if your anger at those church people is exactly the same anger Jesus felt toward the religious leaders of his day? What if your passion for defending the marginalized is exactly what Christianity is supposed to be about?" Sarah's eyes widened. She had never considered this possibility. "Think about it," Charlie continued. "Jesus said the two greatest commandments were to love God and love your neighbor as yourself. He said, 'Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me.' He said, 'Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness.' Sarah, that's you. You hunger and thirst for righteousness." "But I don't believe in God," Sarah said, though her voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Maybe not," Charlie acknowledged. "But you believe in justice, in love, in the inherent worth of every human being. You believe that the strong should protect the weak, that everyone deserves dignity, that hypocrisy is wrong. Where do you think those beliefs come from?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this reframing of everything she thought she knew about herself and her beliefs. "What if," Charlie continued, "the reason you were so hurt by those church people is because deep down you knew they were wrong? What if your sense of what Christianity should be was actually more accurate than theirs?" "I never thought about it that way," Sarah admitted. "Sarah," Charlie said, his voice filled with compassion, "what if God is not your enemy? What if those church people were God's enemies too? What if the reason you hate religious hypocrisy is because God hates religious hypocrisy?" Tears began forming in Sarah's eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of anger. They were tears of confusion, of possibility, of a worldview being gently challenged. "But how can I know?" she asked, her voice barely audible. How can I know the difference between real Christianity and fake Christianity? How can I trust that I won't be hurt again? It was the most vulnerable question she had ever asked, and it revealed the real issue beneath all her intellectual arguments. This wasn't really about history or theology, it was about trust. It was about whether it was safe to hope again. You test it, Charlie said simply. You look at what Jesus actually said and did, and you see if it matches what people claiming to follow him are saying and doing. He paused. And Sarah, here's what I think you'll find. The Jesus of the Bible would have welcomed you and your mother with open arms. He would have been angry at those church people who made you feel unwelcome. He would have defended you against their judgment and called them out for their hypocrisy. Really? Sarah asked, and in that single word was years of pain and longing. Really, Charlie said firmly. And you know what else? I think he put that sense of justice in your heart specifically so you could help make sure his church lives up to his standards. Sarah looked stunned. What do you mean? I mean, maybe your calling isn't to destroy Christianity, Sarah. Maybe it's to help save it. The words hit Sarah like a revelation she never saw coming. Help save Christianity? The idea was so foreign to everything she had believed about herself that she almost laughed. But something in Charlie's earnest expression stopped her. I don't understand, she said quietly. Sarah, you've spent years studying everything wrong with the church, right? You know better than almost anyone how Christians have failed to live up to Jesus' teachings. That's not your weakness, that's your strength. Charlie's voice was gaining intensity, but it was the intensity of excitement, not argument. The church needs people like you, he continued. It needs people who won't accept hypocrisy, who will call out injustice, who will demand that Christians actually act like Christians. It needs people who will say, if you're going to claim Jesus' name, then you better live like Jesus lived. Sarah felt something shifting inside her, like a door opening to a room she never knew existed. But I don't even believe, she started. Belief is a journey, not a destination, Charlie interrupted gently. And honestly, Sarah, you might already believe more than you think you do. You believe in justice. That's one of God's primary attributes. You believe in love. Jesus said that's how people would know his followers. You believe in defending the weak. That's literally what Jesus spent his entire ministry doing. The audience watched in fascination as this intellectual debate transformed into something deeper, more personal, more transformative than anyone had expected. So what are you saying? Sarah asked. I'm saying maybe the reason you've been so passionate about fighting against bad Christianity is because God has been preparing you to fight for good Christianity. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing this complete reframing of her identity and purpose. But those people hurt me, she said finally. They made me feel worthless. I know, Charlie said, his voice filled with compassion, and they were wrong. But Sarah, what if your experience of being rejected by the church could help you make sure no one else ever has to experience that? What if your pain could become someone else's protection? Sarah's notebook slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. She didn't notice. I've been so angry for so long, she whispered. Anger isn't wrong, Sarah. Anger at injustice is holy anger. Jesus himself was angry when he saw people being taken advantage of in the temple. The question isn't whether you should be angry, it's what you do with that anger. Charlie stepped closer, his voice becoming more intimate, more pastoral. You can use that anger to tear down and destroy, or you can use it to build up and protect. You can use it to turn people away from God, or you can use it to turn people toward the real God, the God who defends the fatherless and protects the poor. Sarah looked up at Charlie with tears streaming down her face. I don't know how, she said. You start by forgiving, Charlie said simply. Not because those people deserved it, but because carrying that hurt is poisoning your heart. You forgive them so you can be free to become who you were meant to be. And then what? And then you help build the kind of church community you needed when you were 8 years old. You help create a place where single mothers with no money feel welcomed and loved. You help make sure that the next little girl who walks through those doors knows she belongs there. The transformation happening in Sarah was visible to everyone in the auditorium. The angry militant atheist who had stood up to attack Christianity was becoming someone else entirely, someone softer, more hopeful, more open. Charlie, she said, using his first name for the first time, I'm scared. Of what? of hoping again, of believing again, of trusting again. That's okay, Charlie said. Faith isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to trust despite the fear, and you don't have to do it alone. Sarah nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. I don't know if I'm ready to call myself a Christian, she said. You don't have to, Charlie replied. Labels aren't important right now. What's important is that you're open to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, your story isn't over yet. Maybe it's just beginning. Sarah took a deep breath and looked around the auditorium, seeming to remember for the first time that 500 people had witnessed this entire conversation. I need to think about this, she said. Of course you do, Charlie said. And Sarah, thank you.
For what?
For your questions, for your passion, for your courage, and for reminding all of us why it matters to get this right. Sarah nodded and slowly sat back down. The auditorium remained silent for several moments, everyone processing what they had just witnessed. Friends, Charlie said, returning to the microphone, what just happened here is exactly why we need free speech on college campuses, not so we can avoid hard questions, but so we can engage with them honestly and openly. As the evening continued, the entire tone had changed. Questions were deeper, more thoughtful, more honest. Sarah had broken down a wall that allowed everyone else to be more vulnerable too. After the event, Sarah approached Charlie one more time. How do I start? She asked simply. You already have, Charlie smiled. You already have.